Hello guys, so I'm back again with another game. So this is the continuation of the one d5 response to white's b3. This is also known as the reverse Nimzo Indian. Okay, so let's go ahead and see a Bobby Fischer game. I hope this would be very intuitive and we can learn a lot from this game. Okay, so it's quite the same. Bobby Fischer is playing white, so he goes one b3, and the obvious response is d5. We are learning this. uh, Standard moves bishop b2 c5, and then the obvious response is here is e3. We have seen in the previous games, but Fischer goes nf3. Now even Fischer didn't know the right move order at that time, right? uh, this e3 move is more correct, but let's explore this how eventually it might come to that variation. Knight c6, and here black has 3 f6 with n f3. The best continuation was f6. Anyways, going forward, he didn't play f6, he went for 3 nc6, and now e3. Then the obvious nf6 comes into play. Then again we have the reverse Nimzo Indian, bishop b5, bishop d7 comes into the picture, castle, e6, standard moves guys. d3 is a very important concept of the Nimzo Larsen attack. d3, bishop e7, we obviously give up on this. Bishop into c6, bishop into c6, and e5, rook c8. Standard. But this is a new variation of an old kind of setup. Black intends to recapture on c6 with his rook because uh, obviously he doesn't want to break the pawn structure, but I guess white will not capture the black bishop. Knight e5 is very strong, and I guess the continuation would be f2 to f4, keeping an eye on the center, opening the f file, and also he might try to route the knight to c3, then a4, and put pressure on the c5 square. Okay. The question is like, if black could castle here, would you take on c6, damaging black structure, or would you maintain the knight? Typically, what is suggested is we should take on c6. White's attack is maybe proposition, whereas inflicting damage to black structure is very real. So, mm, basically, if it was not rook c8, it made more sense to. If it was not rook c8 and if black just castled here, it would have been more sense to like paralyze black's queen side. Knight takes bishop and pawn takes knight, so that would have been better. Okay, but black has given this move, rook c8, and white goes for knight d2, not knight c3, knight d2. Okay, so the idea is very strong here, double support on the e5 square maybe. Knight d2, standard f4, we have already seen this. Knight d7, black goes for the exchange. So these are the things. Okay, now I have a question. Instead of knight d7, if if black went for the center thrust d4, what would have happened? Here typically I would have gone knight c6, forcing rook c6, then e4. Okay, and build for a kingside attack. Like after this I would go for this rook lifts, maybe this one first, then connect the rook here. So this would be my sequence of moves, a kingside attack. But well, not a problem with that. We have gone here, and after knight d7, Bobby Fischer goes the strong queen g4. Now queen g4 is actually a very good move here, guys. So queen g4 is actually an exclamation move, threatening knight into c6 and queen into g7 mate. Okay. So what is the ideal thing? And one more thing, guys, I would like to say that this g4 square is more strong than h5. Okay. So g4 square is the best choice. But what is so great about g4? Why? It involves a direct threat with knight into c6, the decoy, okay, or the x-ray. Secondly, it also prevents this f pawn push, like f7 to f6, since this e6 square hangs, right? You cannot just push the pawn. And the trouble with bishop f6, what's the problem with bishop f6? This f6 square, bishop f6. Because knight df3, if I go here for bishop f6, then this knight is staying there. You cannot push away the knight with f6 also. So that's something that's very interesting. Now another question that might come is why can't black respond with f5? Okay, because it's a trap. I will just show you what happens. If f5, the engine clearly suggests that white is better. Queen into g7 check. It's a queen sack. Obviously king into g7, and then you have the knight into c6. Okay. Then you have the bishop f6. Then you have knight into d8. Then you have rook into d8. Okay, and then you have the bishop f6, king into f6, and white is a pawn up. Okay, so this is something that is obviously has to be seen. Now there is another bad thing for black. What happens if after knight takes rook, black goes for the bishop capture? So if black captures the bishop, then it's clearly losing for black, because with this knight into e6 check and king f7, knight into f8, rook f8, so black is clearly an exchange up. You see, rook for the rook, knight for the knight, and rook for the bishop. So this is clearly a winning for white. Okay, so let's go back with our original game. We were at knight fd7, and then we played the move king g4, the queen g4. So, and I explained you why queen g4 is the best suggested move, right? So after queen g4, black continued with knight cross e5, bishop cross e5. Now knight cross e5 was the best possible continuation. Okay, bishop f6. This is the swift adaptation to an emerging threat that is synonymous with survival. This is not a right move, because this violates the principle is if you have a bishop pair, then don't swap them off. Okay, black had a bishop pair, but because of the position he had to swipe it off, so you cannot do it. Okay, so what would be the other alternative? Other alternative might have been this g6 pawn push, but this is also weakening the dark squares. Like queen can come here and queen can route to that square. You know, this is not something that is suggested. All right. So after we have our bishop g6 on the board, then I guess our traditional rook lifts will come. Okay, this is our familiar caveman सदियों से हो रहा ऐसा ही एक attack. By now this maneuver should be easily like understandable of the reverse Nimzo Indian. This is a very Nimzo Indian type of an attack, rook left, rook f3. Okay. And then queen e7. This is kind of a dicey move. Queen e7. There is no pointing in maintaining tension on e5, right? So I guess this was not the intended structure here. Anyways, nothing too much to give away, but the attack that Fischer is trying to bring here is too much. He goes for a queenside battle, but obviously this will not make sense. So on the 16th move, white is clearly kind of dominating. Uh, Definitely this is threatening queen into h7. The threat here is queen into g7 because the bishop has to capture and then the rook will check, and then a lot of crazy things happen, you know. Clearly a lot of crazy things happening. Yes. So that's the threat. Queen takes pawn, bishop takes queen, rook takes bishop, then the king goes to h8, and then I guess rook f7, and then it's a attack. There is nothing to be prevented, and then the king comes back here, and then the queen falls. So it's a nice trick. But black went for a very bad response. Bishop e5, taking the bishop and giving white a massive advantage. F into e5 and f5. This f5 is protecting the g7 square, but this is a half-hearted attempt to ward off a major threat, right? Because we have the en passant here. E takes the pawn, rook f6. Though it might seem that this pawn is still getting defended, but this is not something totally right. The engine gives a point, not point, 1.2 advantage for white, because there is something that is very tricky about this. Okay, what is this? And the move that Bobby Fischer found, and the actual correct move, is queen into g7. Okay, in response to queen into g7, white has to go queen into g7, and then here you have the rook into f6. So just count the pawns. White has 4 plus 3, 7 pawns, and black has 6 pawns currently. So white is clearly a pawn up, and it shouldn't be much of a time where white should be easily able to hold this. Okay, white goes g4, planning to secure his rooks with g5. That is something idea, because you cannot attack this, and you definitely want to exchange it out. Suppose rook f8, you would definitely want to undouble your double pawns. So g4 is the attack. Black goes for a queen side thing, but this e5 square is still weak. So nf3, a into b3, a into b3, king g7, and definitely g5. So the ending is suitable for white. Goes with the e5, and then you have the knight h4 here. The beautiful knight h4, uh, totally infiltrating over the king, and it's an assault, I guess. Bishop d7, preventing the obvious knight f5. You have the rook d6, you cannot help it. Bishop e6, trying to protect. King f2, it's just a continuation. I'm just going with the continuation of the game. Nothing major here to explain. Everybody has a different way of converting the end game, and this is how uh, the game actually went. So this is a clear plus for white. The engine suggests plus 5.2, but it's very difficult to play as black, you know. Contemplations of one's slow deteriorations is an unpleasant meditative thing. So this is kind of a very bad thing. So two principles I would like to share here. The pawn upside, that is white here, the pawn which is up a side, should retain as many pawns as possible on the board. This is an endgame principle. You should never try to exchange pawns. Here you have 5 pawns, so you retain 5 pawns. You did not go for the exchange. And other thing is, fix your opponent's pawns on the same color as his remaining bishop. Okay, so black has a white squared bishop, so you should try to place his pawns on the same color of his bishop, because that restricts the mobility of the bishop. So keep these 2 points in mind. Now after b4, bishop g4 is a move, but it does not help because king comes closer to the board. King e3, rook d7, trying for this d1 square. Let's see how it goes. Then g6, g6, trying to win another pawn. If this is captured here, then this pawn is unprotected, knight takes this pawn and then e5 has to fall. So g6, black goes king f8, gh7, rook h7, knight g6 check, king e8, knight e5, bishop c8, knight c4. This is clearly lost. This is clearly lost. So there is nothing more to talk about. Another principle of the reversed Nimzo Indian we see here, and yes, we will continue to see another games, more games down the line. We will continue with our one response to b3 as d5, and yeah.